his role in that event. Georgia went from Cornell to Boston University, that wonderful school that has taught leaders and teachers and writers and preachers and prophets through the years. And it was there that her mind and her spirit could just take wing. You know, this was an exciting time to be in school. It was the height of the social gospel movement in the United States, where churches had actually rolled up their sleeves and were engaged in with the poor and urban ministries. And there was a sense, can you imagine being in school at this time, a young person at this time, a sense that we can change the world. We can help the kingdom of God here on earth. We just simply need to reach out, to educate, to be among the people. And God will be triumphant. And it was an exciting time. You know, Georgia was the generation just before the Reverend Martin Luther King, for example, went to Boston University. This was a university that was alive and active, an exciting place to be. And there, I think maybe she was tooled for the rest of her life in all the different ways she would be involved. She went from Boston University and eventually taught. She ended up teaching all her life, 4 different institutions: Elmira College in New York, which was a women's college, Mount Holyoke, also a women's college better known perhaps, then 2 seminaries, Garrett in Chicago, it's still United Methodist Seminary, and the Pacific School of Religion in California. And the whole time, though, that she was teaching, she was always busy and active. Writing, she wrote scads of articles. She wrote in the course of her lifetime 37 books, not including the one she was working on at the time she died in her 80s. And these books were always meant to be books that any person could pick up and read and get something from. They weren't just written for publication or for some ivory tower academic circle or for some, to make her famous and to make her glitter. They were for the people. There were generations of lay people and practicing clergy preaching in their pulpits who thanked Georgia Harkness for making theology and faith accessible and make it make sense and make it be something you engage in everyday life. Her little book, and it's not, they weren't big, thick books. Her little book, Understanding the Christian Faith, spent 2 decades being reprinted because it was so valuable to the people in the church. She wrote about all these types of things, and she would speak everywhere to Sunday school classes and churches and gatherings. She traveled around the world as part of various commissions. And during that time, besides her involvement with issues like women, she was engaged in all kinds of social activities relating to immigration, civil rights, racism. She protested the United Methodist Church becoming the United Methodist Church in 1968 because we still had a system of institutionalized racism within the Methodist Church. And she said we need to get rid of that before we create a new church. She was very involved in interfaith and ecumenical movements. You heard in the language that in the anthem that was sung about the unity of all peoples and all nations. And that was part of the other huge activity that she was passionate about, and that was activity as a pacifist and the means of reconciliation throughout the world. This is partly from her Quaker roots, partly from a trip that she took to Europe right after World War I and saw the suffering and the poverty from war, from the retributions laid upon Germany at that time. She was a pacifist for the rest of her life, outspoken about it, involved with it, even through times that were really difficult to be a pacifist, like during World War II, for example. No, she stuck to the issue that we must love our enemies. War is never an option, and this means even loving Nazis. It even means loving somebody like Hitler. And you can imagine that when other people fell away, Georgia Harkness still stayed in that pacifism role, that it was a tough one for her, but she was used to being the only one saying something many times. In the end, though, it's not just her achievements that I admire, the way she shaped the church, Methodism in many ways. It's actually also how personally she engaged theology in her life and how she continued to learn. When she was in her early 50s, and this would have been during World War II, so it was a hard time for her, She went through a real a time of great suffering and trial for her, the kind that people do come to sometimes. She was very depressed. She had physical problems that brought about chronic pain that she'd have for the rest of her life. And she found herself in a spiritual wilderness. She couldn't feel God. She couldn't hear God. She couldn't believe in God. She reached this faith crisis in the middle of her suffering time. And in true Georgia Harkness fashion, she studied and she wrote about this experience. And she went back to ancient Christian writers and fell in love with Brother Lawrence. And St. John of the Cross wrote a book called The Dark Night of the Soul, which is a phrase from St. John of the Cross identifying this experience. For her, she was always the kind of person that, by her willpower, by her strength, by her activity, by her involvement, she was going to save the world. And she found out instead that she needed to be saved. During this time, her father died. And she spent some time with him right before his death. And he was talking to her, and he was so proud of her. And he said, Georgia, you write all these books, and they're really good books. But I wish you would write more about Jesus Christ. She discovered that not only did she need the powerful, triumphant God, she needed the suffering, loving Christ in her life. She needed not only her intellect, she needed her to be a balanced person. And she went on to teach other people about that and give them hope. This is what happens when we engage our faith with what's going on in our own lives and with the world. When we talk about God, when we think about God and ask questions about God, then we are able to continuously learn and offer hope for the world.